In the early 1980s, the leaders of Harley-Davidson faced a brutal business crisis. Their brand-new motorcycles were bleeding oil right onto the dealership floors before a single customer could even buy them. Inside these quiet, sad showrooms, the heavy smell of fresh rubber mixed with the undeniable scent of failure. A worker would spend hours polishing the chrome of a machine fresh from the factory, only to look down and see a dark puddle forming on the pristine white tiles. It was a crushing, daily shame. This was not just a mechanical defect, it was a deeply embarrassing public defeat for an American icon. The men and women who sold these machines had to look loyal riders in the eye and pretend everything was fine, while secretly knowing the product was falling apart. The heavy sadness in those rooms was suffocating, as the proud rumble of a legendary engine was replaced by the quiet, steady drip of leaking oil. The destruction of this legendary brand did not happen overnight. It began years earlier when a massive corporation bought Harley-Davidson and decided to change the rules of the game. Instead of focusing on the careful human craft of building a great motorcycle, the new corporate bosses demanded more bikes, built faster, and made as cheaply as possible. Quality control was stripped down, and the soul of the machine was traded for quick profit. Step by step, the pride of the factory floor was systematically dismantled. It was exactly like watching a champion fighter lose their heart to a team of greedy trainers who only cared about the next payday, not the legacy of the sport. The assembly lines were pushed to the breaking point, the workers lost their voice, and the motorcycles rolling out the doors were broken before they even hit the highway. That relentless corporate push for cheap speed had hollowed out the company from the inside, leaving it entirely defenseless against what was coming next. Just as Harley-Davidson was falling apart, a terrifying new force arrived on the horizon. Japanese manufacturers flooded the American market with motorcycles that felt like they were from the future. These new bikes were incredibly fast, incredibly light, and most importantly, they never leaked a single drop of oil. For the struggling workers in America, watching these flawless imports glide down the streets was a devastating blow to their spirit. It felt exactly like a bruised, exhausted fighter looking across the ring and seeing a perfect, unbeatable machine stepping through the ropes. The new rivals were cheaper, they were better engineered, and they were quickly stealing the hearts of riders who had once sworn loyalty to the American brand. Facing an opponent that simply did not make mistakes, the American giant was pushed straight to the edge of total collapse. Imagine standing on the sidewalk, watching a wrecking ball swing toward your family's home because you simply cannot pay the bills. That deep, twisting knot in your stomach is exactly what the workers at Harley-Davidson felt every single morning. The threat of bankruptcy was no longer just a word in a newspaper. It was a shadow hanging over their kitchen tables and their children's futures. This was never just a job where you punched a clock and went home. For the people of the towns that built these machines, the company was their identity, their community, and their family names stamped into steel. If the factory gates closed forever, it would not just erase a paycheck. It would bulldoze the very home they had built together for generations. In 1981, 13 executives inside Harley-Davidson looked at their dying company and made a choice that defied all conventional financial sense. They simply refused to let this 80-year-old American icon fade into manufacturing history under the mismanagement of its parent corporation, AMF. They banded together to launch a highly publicized management buyout, an incredibly high-stakes maneuver where the people running the daily operations attempt to purchase the entire enterprise outright for $81.5 million. To pull off this massive transaction, these executives had to walk into major financial institutions like Citicorp and beg for capital to buy a business that was actively bleeding cash. They laid their personal financial lives entirely on the line, using their own private homes, stock portfolios, and life savings as collateral to secure the crushing loans. It was a wild, incredibly brave rescue mission fueled by pure desperation and an absolute refusal to surrender. When the ink finally dried on the complex banking contracts in June of 1981, the ownership officially transferred away from a faceless conglomerate. Suddenly, the entire fate of the legendary motorcycle brand rested squarely on the shoulders of 13 men, including visionary designer Willie G. Davidson and determined chief executive Vaughn Beals. You have to pause and wonder at the sheer audacity of this incredibly risky choice. Why would any rational executive willingly bet the roof over their family's head on a struggling factory network that was notorious for churning out broken, oil-leaking machines? It was a deeply personal decision that completely ignored the cold, hard mathematical realities of corporate business survival during a brutal economic recession. But for these 13 investors, this transaction was never just about quarterly numbers or profit margins. It was about a deep, almost unexplainable devotion to the historic Harley-Davidson name and the iconic rumbling pulse of the heavyweight V-twin engines they proudly built. Their massive financial gamble proves how human pride and an irrational love for a manufacturing legacy stretching back to 1903 can push people to take extreme risks that no business school textbook would ever recommend. Then the sun came up the morning after the historic rescue operation. The initial rush of corporate victory quickly faded, the champagne toasts stopped, and a genuinely terrifying financial reality immediately set in. They finally owned the legendary company they loved, but they had effectively inherited an absolute operational disaster plagued by bloated inventories, terrible quality control metrics, and a rapidly shrinking customer base. The outdated assembly lines in Pennsylvania were still pushing out heavy motorcycles that famously leaked dark oil straight onto dealership showroom floors. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Japanese manufacturing giants like Honda and Yamaha were steadily producing flawless, lightning-fast, and highly reliable machines that were rapidly capturing the entire global market. The 13 leaders had successfully bought the legendary ship, but the massive steel hull was still sinking rapidly into a sea of red ink. The crushing weight of their newly acquired corporate debt, combined with punishing early 1980s interest rates that hovered near a staggering 18%, made every single unsold motorcycle sitting in a warehouse feel like a ticking financial time bomb. They needed an immediate radical transformation in their manufacturing process just to make their next agonizing loan payment. To actually survive this mounting crisis, the new owners had to take the most painful step imaginable and completely swallow their fierce, traditional American pride. The top Harley-Davidson executives packed their bags and traveled directly to the state-of-the-art factories of their greatest international rivals in Japan. They walked through those massive doors not as arrogant competitors, but as incredibly desperate students hoping to learn exactly how to build a fundamentally better machine. What the American executives found inside those foreign manufacturing plants delivered an absolute shock to their traditional industrial system. Instead of chaotic, dirty warehouses overflowing with spare inventory, they saw pristine, highly organized assembly lines using just-in-time production, where precision parts fit together perfectly on the very first try. They instantly realized they had to completely rebuild how they made motorcycles from the ground up, adopting this strict statistical quality control discipline just to keep their iconic brand alive. That painful trip across the ocean to study their rivals proved one hard truth. Harley-Davidson could never beat the competition at making a quiet, perfect, cheap machine. The executives returned home with a heavy realization that they had to stop trying to be something they were not. They stopped looking at the clean assembly lines of the enemy and started looking at their own messy, loud history. A Japanese motorcycle was built to be polite, to get a rider from one place to another without a single rattle or drop of oil. Harley-Davidson engines shook the ground. They roared, they spit, and they demanded physical strength just to hold them steady on the highway. The leaders finally understood that this roughness was not a flaw, but their greatest weapon. They were not selling simple transportation to get to work. They were selling a loud, shaking, roaring soul made of steel. They were selling the feeling of absolute freedom, the dream of riding on an open road where no boss or time clock could reach you. To build on this raw feeling, the company looked closely at the people who had stayed with them during the darkest years. These were not rich bankers or quiet office workers. The people who kept buying Harleys, even when the engines leaked and the parts broke, were the rebels. They were rough, tough men and women who wore heavy leather and lived outside the normal rules of society. These riders felt like outcasts in the regular world, but on a heavy, loud motorcycle, they felt like kings. They did not care if the machine was perfect, because they were not perfect themselves. Seeing this fierce loyalty from the outcasts gave the struggling company a brilliant, desperate idea. If they could capture that intense feeling of brotherhood and share it with everyday people, they might just survive. In 1983, the company made a choice that changed the business world forever by starting the Harley Owners Group. They decided that buying a motorcycle should not be the end of the relationship, but the very first step into a new life. When someone bought a new bike, the company did not just hand over the keys and say goodbye. Instead, they invited that buyer to join a massive nationwide family. They gave them a patch for their jacket, a membership card, and a reason to gather with thousands of other riders on the weekends. The company executives themselves started riding in these massive groups, side by side with the customers, sharing the dirt, the wind, and the noise of the highway. This simple act of riding together turned a struggling factory into an unbreakable brotherhood. The customers stopped being just buyers and became fierce defenders of the brand, ready to fight for the company as if it were their own flesh and blood. At its core, this survival strategy tapped into something every single human being understands. Deep down, we all just want a place where we fit in, a place where people accept us exactly as we are. Extreme loyalty is rarely about the metal, the rubber, or the price tag of a product. At its core, this intense devotion was never really about the motorcycles themselves. It was about filling a quiet, universal emptiness that every person feels at some point in their life. We all just want a place where we fit in, a tribe that accepts us exactly as we are without asking us to change. Harley-Davidson stopped selling machines and started offering an identity, a guaranteed seat at a table where the outcasts suddenly felt like kings. That deep human need to belong transformed the company's financial reality throughout the late 1980s. When executives looked at the records from the newly formed Harley Owners Group in 1983, they saw something impossible happening across America. People were not just buying a mode of transportation to get from Milwaukee to Chicago. They were buying a lifelong membership into a family that promised they would never have to ride alone. The ultimate proof of this trust was written directly onto the bodies of the riders. Across the country, men and women walked into dimly lit parlors and asked artists to permanently ink the Harley-Davidson bar and Shield logo into their skin. This was a profound, heavy commitment that went far beyond normal customer satisfaction. You do not bleed for a brand unless that brand has become a part of your soul. By marking themselves for life, these riders were making a public vow of absolute loyalty, turning their own flesh into a living, breathing testament to a company they believed had saved them from isolation. Those permanent scars of devotion proved that the brand had secured something far more valuable than mere market share, setting the stage for a miraculous financial recovery. Because the riders felt this deep, unbreakable love, they opened their wallets without hesitation. They bought the expensive new bikes, the heavy leather jackets, and the replacement parts, even when cheaper, faster Japanese alternatives were sitting right across the street. This extreme, irrational loyalty became an impenetrable shield that defended Harley-Davidson from bankruptcy, giving the company the vital cash flow it needed to finally fix its manufacturing flaws and survive. The long-term consequence of this survival forged an entirely new blueprint for corporate endurance. By 1986, the company that had been days away from total collapse achieved the unthinkable, officially returning to the public stock market. That successful public offering was not just a financial victory, it was a loud declaration that human emotion could actually rescue a dying industrial giant. The very executives who had nervously signed the paperwork to buy the failing company just a few years earlier now stood at the bell of the New York Stock Exchange, completely vindicated by the faith of the people they served. Back in the factories of Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, the human aftermath of this incredible rescue could be seen in the steady rhythm of the assembly lines. Thousands of factory workers who had spent years terrified of losing their homes and their livelihoods finally felt the heavy dread lift from their shoulders. Generations of families who had built these machines with their bare hands were guaranteed a future. The rust and the shame of the dark years were swept off the factory floors, replaced by a quiet, fierce pride that radiated through the small towns relying on those jobs to survive. By 1986, just 5 years after a desperate management buyout, Harley-Davidson achieved something the financial world thought was impossible. They returned to the public market with a highly successful IPO, raising $90 million and silencing the critics who had written their obituary. This was not just a financial victory on Wall Street, but a massive shockwave that forced every major corporation to rewrite their understanding of brand loyalty. The executives in Milwaukee had proven that when a company stops acting like a simple factory and starts acting like a custodian of a shared identity, the traditional rules of market share no longer apply. The survival of the motor company established a new blueprint for corporate turnarounds. Competitors who had once dominated by simply manufacturing cheaper, faster machines suddenly found themselves fighting against an invisible barrier of pure emotional devotion. Harley-Davidson demonstrated that a business could actually weaponize its own vulnerability, turning a near-death experience into a rallying cry that bonded the consumer to the product forever. It was a stark lesson for global industries, proving that while perfect engineering can win a season, a fiercely protected community can sustain an empire for generations. Today, long after the factory floors have quieted and the boardroom battles have faded into history, the true weight of that victory is measured not in profit margins, but in sound. Somewhere out on an empty stretch of highway, a heavy V-twin engine fires up, echoing with a distinct, uneven rumble that refuses to be silenced. It is the sound of a broken machine that learned how to survive, carrying the pride of every outcast who believed in it when the rest of the world walked away.